In this video, we're going to dive deeper into making classes, and we're going to go over the alignment of text along with padding, border, and margin. Let's go ahead and start by making a new class. We're going to call this class main, open bracket, close bracket. Now for main, I want the text to be aligned in the center. So text-align is the property we're going to use, and the value is going to be center. I want this class applied within my h2 tag. So I'm going to say class equals main. Now when I save both of these files and refresh, you can see that instructed by May was moved over to the center. For text align, there's also left and right. But I'm going to leave it set to center for now. What I'm going to go over next is going to be all about the positioning. So a way an element is structured is that you have the element itself, then you have padding around that element. That padding is surrounded by a border, and that border is surrounded by margins. This H2 is the element that we're looking at currently. And the padding is the little buffer around the element itself, but still within the borders. So think of the element as a castle, and the padding as the city inside those castle walls. So we're going to start with padding. And let's give the padding 20 pixels, just so you can see the change. So now when I refresh, you can see the text from our P element and the text from our H1 element is separated more from our H2 element that we have here. Now let's put a border around it so you can see where the border lies. And I'm going to start with a solid border, and we'll go over more border properties later in this video. Save, refresh. Now you can see where the border is. So if I was to go back in and change the padding, let's make the padding to 40, you'll see the padding change within the border, stretching the border out further. So here's our castle. Our padding is the land within the castle walls, which is our border, or our castle walls. And now we're going to do the margin. And the margin you can think of as the rest of the land in your domain, the outlying villages. So we're going to go to margin. And let's make the margin 40 pixels, just like our padding. When I refresh, you can see that now there are 40 pixels surrounding the border on every side. Then the border itself, the padding, which is 40 pixels around, and then the element. Now say we wanted to apply this same class to our first H1 element, CSS tutorials. Well, we already have the class large, but to add another class, simply put a space between the two classes, leaving them within the quotation marks. So when you save that, now you will see that CSS tutorials is also surrounded by a border with 40 pixels padding and 40 pixels margin. Now, for these main classes, I don't want the same main for H1 that I have for H2. I want two separate mains. So I'm going to go to my class, and I'm going to say h1.main, which specifies this as the H1 main class. Go ahead and copy that, paste, And now we have an H1 main and change this to H2 main. Now when we save this, nothing is going to change because the H1 main has the same exact values as the H2 main. But let's change this text align to the right for our H2. When we save and refresh, you can see that even though both H1 and H2 have the main class, because this is the H2.main, it's only going to change for this H2 selector. And this is just how to customize even more in depth with classes. So I have the text aligned to the right. Now let's go over padding a little more in depth. So padding, if I have one value there, it will change the top, right, bottom, and left padding, all of those values. However, if I wanted them each to be different, I could say, starting with the first number, that's our top. The next number is our right, which I want to be 0 pixels. The next is our bottom, which let's go ahead and do 20 pixels again. And the left, 0. So now you see the change. I have no padding on my right hand side, no padding on my left hand side, but still 20 pixels above and below my element. If I only want to change one padding value from the initial top, right, bottom, and left padding, I only want padding on the bottom, so I'm going to say padding dash bottom, and let's go ahead and make that 20 pixels. So you can see that I only have padding on the bottom now. I think 20 is a little bit extreme for what I want to do, so I'm going to go ahead and say 5 pixels. There we go. Now let's go over some more of our border. The border has many different values. It can be solid, dashed, double border, etc. So for this one, I want it to be dashed. So write the value dashed for border and refresh. Similar to padding, you can have a left border, right border, top border, bottom border, or just an overall border around everything. But I want my border to be on the bottom, so border dash bottom. Refresh, and you can see that my border is only on the bottom now. For border, I'm also able to change the weight, so the size or thickness of that border, as well as the color if I wanted to. So if I want it to be super extreme, I can make this 10 pixels, still dashed, and let's call the color green. When I refresh, you can see that the border is thicker, still dashed, and the color is changed to green. For this, I want to leave the color the same as it is for H2. And H2 is that A4C3B2, which was our gray-green. So that's the color that this border will take on in this class automatically. And instead of having something large, I'd rather do a smaller pixel value. So let's go with 2 pixels. Now margin is similar to padding again, as it has top, right, bottom, and left values. So let's do 40 pixels for the top, 50 pixels for the right, 0 pixels for the bottom, and another 50 pixels for the left. You can see that the margin went away on the bottom, and if the border was still completely outlined, you would see that it's in 50 pixels from the right and left, and in 40 pixels from the top. And if you wanted to use percentages as opposed to pixels or mix and match, that's completely fine. Let's go back up and adjust our H1. I'm going to make the overall padding a little bit less. Let's say 30. I like the solid border, and I like the size that it's at. I'm not going to change that, but I am going to adjust the margin. So I want the top margin to be 10 pixels. The right margin, let's do a percentage. I want to bring this in 40%. The bottom margin, now remember, this H1 and H2 element come before and after each other. So whatever the margin is here for the top, which was 40 pixels, the spacing between the two elements will be that top margin of the bottom element plus the bottom margin of this top element. So if I did 10 pixels, now the space between them will be 50 pixels total, because that's the top margin plus this bottom margin of 10 pixels. And then for the left-hand side, I want that to also be 40%. Let's change these. I think 40% will be a little too much, so let's change it to 30%. Save, refresh, and you can see I now have a 10 pixel margin from the top. The margin between these two is the 10 pixel bottom margin plus the 40 pixel top margin, and it's 30% in from the left and the right. I really like the way the h1.main looks right now, but I want to change the margin for my h2 main. So I'm going to make that 30% for the right and 30% for the left as well. Save and refresh, and you can see that they are now in line. Let's go ahead and make this margin a little bit less so this bottom border extends out a little bit more. So let's do 20% and 20%. Takeaways from this video are using the class selector more in depth and applying it with specific elements. We also went over aligning text, and we went over how the element relates to the padding relating to the border and how that relates with the margins. Remember our castle analogy. The element is like the castle, the padding is like the city or the dwellers within the castle walls being the border, and the margin is the domain or your outlying kingdom. And don't forget to click the like button, subscribe, and comment if you have further questions.